name is Tom, welcome to my channel Live My Journey, and to my extended review of Dji Air 2S. I have had Mavic Air 2S since the second day after the premiere and watched a bunch of other reviews, and I felt like most of them went for style over substance. Because of this, I decided to go much more in depth into the review and comparison. It may be much longer than a typical video of this kind, but hopefully you'll find all the info you need to make an informed decision while choosing from a current DJI lineup. I will be comparing the new Air 2S to its closest competitors, Mavic 2 Pro and Mavic Air 2, and I will be going in depth into the common features and differences. I have previously used Mavic 2 Pro for over 2 years and Mavic Air 2 for just over a year. If I had to describe what this new drone is to the two predecessors, I could call it a fun version of serious professional Mavic 2 Pro or a more capable version of fun-oriented Mavic Air 2. When compared with both these drones, it sheds a few features, but at the same time it gains a few more that potentially can put it on top of a food chain for consumer drones. So starting with Mavic Air 2, we lose 3 minutes of theoretical battery life. We lose the quad bear specific HDR mode that was able to capture lights and shadows with different sensitivity settings and mash them all together into SDR video. But bear with me on this one, unlike many of the other reviews claim, we didn't actually lose the HDR. We did lose high frame rate, but low quality 240 FPS mode. Some of the features found on Mavic 2 Pro that did not make an appearance in the latest drone are the aperture, limited as it was, the famed Hasselblad color science, the ability to use custom style settings like adjusting sharpness, contrast and saturation. We lose the tripod mode, which is replaced with a much faster and smoother cine mode. The side sensors also did not make it into the latest drone. So far it may sound a tad disappointing, but fear not. We do get a few features, some of which can be real game changers. DJI Air 2S gains ability to record in 5.4K, the highest resolution among DJI consumer drones. It now has the widest lens among the DJI lineup with the 22mm equivalent. It offers 10-bit flat log profile in all resolutions and frame rates available, unlike the Autel Evo 2 Pro, a drone that supposedly sports the same 1-inch sensor as Air 2S. Coincidentally, the 6K resolution claimed by the Autel is the same resolution that DJI is calling 5.4. Air 2S is now able to fly faster than any other DJI camera drone while maintaining collision sensor protection, and can climb and descend at astonishing rates. It also has an updated gimbal that allows it to fly forward at full speed without worry of ruining the shot by the camera suddenly dipping. It's something that Mavic 2 Pro and Mavic Air 2, and especially the Mini 2, were prone to do. Another feature we are gaining is called Master Shot. This feature will allow the drone to plan and execute a series of dynamic shots that can later be used to enrich your own footage. Alternatively, you can let the DJI Fly app edit a short clip using the footage to some music. I very much like the idea of this mode. I can see myself using it to run my battery down and capture additional shots that I haven't thought about myself, and an easy way to put myself in some of my footage. Do not mistake this mode with fun but mostly useless quick shots. Now let's get into the finer details. The drone itself looks very similar to Mavic Air 2. The only difference is being the gimbaled camera and the sensors on top of the body. These new sensors will benefit us threefold. First and most obvious benefit is the new ability for the drone to avoid obstacles above it. As good as collision avoidance was in Air 2, it was somewhat prone to missing obstacles directly above it and ending in a pile on the ground. This should no longer be a problem. We can feel safer flying under the canopy of trees, etc. without disabling return to home. The second benefit is additional protection for the drone while flying forward at both speed or against the wind. Previously, the drone used to come up with a message saying that because of the wind, because of the attitude of the drone, the sensors have now been disabled. This, in turn, brings us to quite a significant change, which is the speed. DJI Air 2 can now travel horizontally with sensors enabled at a speed of 15 meters a second. This is 1 meter a second or 3.6 kilometers an hour more than the larger Mavic 2 Pro. It's also 3 meters a second or 11 kilometers an hour faster than a Mavic Air 2. A2S can now ascend and descend even faster than the other drones with a speed of 6 meters a second for both. In comparison, to the maximum of 4 meters a second for ascent and 3 meters a second for descent for Mavic Air 2 and 5 and 4 for Mavic 2 Pro. The top speed that the drone can now achieve in sports mode without protection of collision sensors is still 68 kilometers an hour, which works out about 4 kilometers an hour less than Mavic 2 Pro. In terms of wind resistance, all three drones have been rated as equals, but in real life, both Mavic Air 2 and Air 2S will allow you to capture longer exposure photos in more severe conditions than it is possible with Mavic 2 Pro. The latter gains a bit of advantage in vertical stabilization due to weight difference. This should give this drone an upper hand in low-level hyperlapses where the altitude of both Air 2 models should fluctuate more readily. The flight characteristic of the Air 2S is very well balanced between aggression that comes from the increased speed and overall smoothness of Air 2 platform. I found both Air 2 drones to be far smoother and more pleasant to fly than Mavic 2 Pro. In the newer drones, we gain an extra benefit of yaw axis smoothing. It works similar to gimbal tilt smoothing by dampening in the input and making the speed changes more gradual. This is invaluable in achieving smooth unbroken camera movements. So now let's talk about the gimbal. Looking at the specification of the new gimbal, it looks identical to Mavic Air 2. However, like I've mentioned previously, the gimbal is no longer prone to drop the camera when flying forward at speeds and against the wind. To me, this is a massive improvement over both older drones, as it will now allow you to capture more dynamic shots without worrying of spoiling the video by a sudden change of camera angle. The camera can still tilt up by 24 degrees. That's 6 degrees less than Mavic 2 Pro. You should, however, consider a massive difference in the field of view between the two drones, giving Air 2S a de facto win. Lastly, we still have the ability to control the movement of the gimbal in all directions by holding the finger on the screen. Now to the camera. The new camera of Air 2S is a real marvel, in drone terms anyway. The 1-inch equivalent sensor used in this camera offers improvement over both older drones. It's definitely more obvious looking at the video performance than the photography. All three cameras offer slightly different field of view. It's respectively 77 degrees or 28 mm for Mavic 2 Pro, 84 degrees or 24 mm for Mavic Air 2, and 88 degrees or 22 mm for Air 2S. While different focal lengths offer a photographer or a videographer different image properties, in my opinion, the wider the field of view for the drone camera, the better. We have enough resolution from all three cameras that we could crop in quite a bit into the image during the edit without compromising the quality. Wider field of view is good choice for landscapes, etc. They are also easier to stabilize. All three cameras produce good sharp images with good details and color reproduction. The sensor used in Mavic 2 Pro has a tendency to heat up and produce progressively more and more noisy images. Mavic Air 2's very detailed 48 megapixel mode creates some brushstroke artifacts on the high crop values and has a reduced dynamic range. It also produces a slightly noisier image to the 12 megapixel photos. Air 2S produces similar results to Mavic 2 Pro with a decreased noise. The color reproduction is slightly different, but I find the new drone to give more natural colors that I preferred. Please look for a link in the video description for a bunch of raw photos and video clips. It's probably best for you to have a closer look and decide for yourself. The camera modes are pretty much identical on all of these drones, and the final difference I can mention is focus. Both Mavic 2 Pro and Air 2S have selective focus feature, while the Air 2 has a fixed focus. Selective focus in some scenarios can allow for a sharper image, while on the flip side, poorly set can lead to image quality deterioration. The only drone with adjustable aperture among these three is the Mavic 2 Pro, but all three have the same value of f2.8 wide open. I believe that aperture in drone photography is for most part redundant. Mavic 2 Pro has its sharpest aperture value at f4, and the image starts to deteriorate above f5.6 with values above f7 struggling with tons of diffraction. Let's now move on to the video. I can start on the point of contention for few reviewers that videos I have watched, which is the lack of adjustable aperture in Air 2S. In order to introduce motion blur, videographers use so-called 180-degree rule, which dictates that the right shutter speed to achieve this effect is 1/2 times FPS. Generally speaking, we want to lock the shutter to this value and use aperture, ND filters and ISO to control the exposure. In reality, the aperture gives us ability to fine-tune the exposure, with the biggest factor, depending on the light conditions, still being the ND filter. We can also safely adjust the shutter speed up to 2 stops up and down. As an example, using 1/60th of a second for a 30 FPS video, I can go down 2 stops to 1/30th of a second, adding to the motion blur, or going the other way around to 1/20th of a second, slightly reducing it. In reality, this rule is more of a guideline. The motion blur will be more important to some shots than others. Camera moves like quick yaw movements, fast flight at low altitude or close to an object will benefit from motion blur, while a slow, smooth movements and flight at great altitudes will see little change. Motion blur can also be added in post-production. In the Air 2S, after selecting correct shutter speed, we can also select Auto ISO mode. We set the EV to a negative amount, for example -2. The drone will then only adjust exposure by smoothly raising ISO when the EV drops below the selected level. Do not mistake this with how the auto exposure works in full auto mode. Once you select the EV value in auto mode, the camera will always try to match it, constantly changing exposure, leading to very unprofessional looking results. Going back to other reviews, interestingly, few of the reviewers who have mentioned importance of aperture have made even bigger mistakes of mixing footages with different frame rates, making the drone footage stand out as very choppy. Mind boggles. A few days after receiving my drone, I shot comparison videos that I uploaded to YouTube. It was very well received, and I have had no comments on the lack of motion blur despite shooting the material without ND filters and using very high shutter speeds. I think that sums it up very well. Now let's crack on with the good stuff. 5.4K. For someone who's quite savvy with video production, access to this resolution will mean more choices. You can super sample, meaning producing a video in lower resolution like the popular 4K, and yet getting better overall video quality than by shooting video in straight 4K. You can also use the extra resolution to crop in, giving you virtually adjustable focal length. Cropping all the way from 5.4 to 4K will give you an equivalent of 1.42 times zoom, or going from 22mm to about 31mm in post-production. Look at this example on how much dynamic movement this could potentially add to your shots. Air 2S can zoom in up to 4.3 times in 4K resolution, but only in normal color profile. This can't be done in either 5.4K or one of the 10-bit profiles. It's obviously not a lossless zoom, but only getting to about 2 times we start noticing deterioration in image quality. I believe it's still very usable at ×2. Another benefit of the new camera is lack of crop in all natural frame rates between 24 and 30 FPS and all resolutions. In comparison, Mavic 2 Pro, in its HQ mode that retained best quality image, had to use crop from the middle of the sensor, narrowing down the already narrow field of view from 77 degrees to 55 degrees or 40mm equivalent. The alternative was a FOV mode, where the image from the whole 5.4K sensor was being downscaled to 4K with a significant loss of quality. In terms of higher frame rates, the Mavic Air 2 has a slight advantage in the lineup by having a 4K 60 crop-free mode, while Air 2S crops in the 4K 60 mode to about 1.42 or 31mm equivalent. The Mavic 2 Pro sadly can't compete at all due to not being able to record in 4K 60 at all, and having the 2.7K 60 mode so compromised in quality that in fact the 2.7K 60 image from Mini 2 looks better in comparison. No joke. Although all the drones are capable of shooting 120 frames per second in 1080p and the Mavic Air 2 even 240 frames per second, I would disregard these for the lack of quality. I would always much rather shoot a 4K 60 video and slow it down with optical flow for best effect. Both Mavic 2 Pro and Air 2S have similar 3 color profiles, namely 8-bit ready-baked normal, flat 10-bit D-Log that allows for the most flexibility in post-production, and HLG. The last profile is a 10-bit hybrid profile with light information for both HDR and SDR devices. All 3 profiles on Mavic Air 2 are 8-bit only. The normal is very similar to the same profile on both the other drones. The D Cine-like is a D-Log-esque profile that is meant for post-production. It won't be as flexible and will retain less data, but at the same time it will produce more noise than the flat images from Mavic 2 Pro and Air 2S. The third profile is the quad bay unique HDR mode that actually produces SDR videos that are assembled from 2 exposures for each frame, a bit like exposure bracketed photos. In some scenarios like sunset it can produce good results, but on the other hand it's a full auto mode that leaves no room for adjustments, and in many situations it will make quite a mess of the image. It could have worked so much better if you could at least lock the maximum EV value so that the camera wouldn't overexpose the image. Now, comparing 10-bit profiles between Mavic 2 Pro and Air 2S, I found D-Log of Air 2S super easy to grade quickly and get great results, while the 2 Pro counterpart I found to be a bit of a nightmare when it came to bringing out natural colors. Also, the HLG profile, that is my absolute favorite in Air 2S, producing high dynamic video with very accurate colors. On Mavic 2 Pro, it still requires quite a lot of processing. It also has a tendency to squash information in shadows into a light grey mess. I know this may be a controversial opinion, but the selling point of Mavic 2 Pro, which was the Hasselblad color science, to me it was its greatest downfall. I ended up using normal mode with decreased saturation and contrast instead. Another interesting point is that the both 10-bit color profiles on Mavic 2 Pro require optical correction to be carried out in post, meaning that the image we get straight out of the camera has a fisheye effect. All the optical corrections are done in camera in all modes for both Air 2 models. Just to be prudent, I will mention that all 3 drones produce very good quality image, with the biggest difference being the dynamic range. On both of the drones with 1-inch sensor, it will be much easier to keep exposure under control and get great images in more difficult lighting conditions. The Air 2S has most naturally sharp image, while the Air 2 has an image that is very sharp but looks artificially sharpened, while the Mavic 2 Pro has an image that is softer but more pleasing for some people, while still being rich in detail. I have noticed that Air 2S produces the video with the least noise in lower ISO, with Mavic 2 Pro being in the middle and Air 2, especially in the D Cine-like, producing the most noise. The sheer dynamic range in the video has to go to Air 2S as well, despite theoretically Mavic 2 Pro having the range of 14 stops in comparison to 12.6 stops on Air 2S. I feel that the camera of the Air 2S is enough of an upgrade to justify upgrading from either of the 2 older drones. On the flip side, I do realize that for many people these differences will sound more like nuance. Focus track. I have done some testing of the amazing focus track that was one of my favorite upgrades moving from Mavic 2 Pro to Air 2. It's all still here and it feels more responsive and fine-tuned than before. If you're unsure how great are these features, please look for my video on focus track. Unfortunately, the focus track is still only available in up to 4K and 30 frames per second. Also, the optical bypass mode, or APAS, is not available in resolution of 5.4K. The drone will obviously avoid crashing into objects, but it will not attempt to fly around them. The zoom feature is also only available in 8-bit normal profile and only up to 4K resolution. The transmission protocol that is responsible for the remote control and the video uplink has been upgraded to 03, with addition of 2 extra antennas in the rear arms of the Air 2S. Although I have done no extreme range tests, I could straight away see the improvement in terms of how stable uplink was and how good quality image it actually sends from the drone. I was astonished when looking through some of my 1080p cache images saved on my phone. The battery life, according to spec sheets, has decreased to maximum 31 minutes in optimal conditions. I estimate to average about 23 minutes, which can be further shortened by excessive speed and wind. The accessories. The majority of accessories that fit Mavic Air 2 should also fit Air 2S. The exception will obviously be the ND filters. The batteries are exactly the same. While the props have been improved, they will fit both models just as well. The sound of the new props is slightly lower and more pleasing to the ear. The controller sold with Air 2S is the same great controller that was introduced with Mavic Air 2 and later used in Mini 2. It's slightly less pocketable than the folding controller provided with Mavic 2 Pro and lacks the screen with telemetry, but the top-loaded device holder / antenna is much more convenient, and the battery life and ergonomy blow the old design out of the water. The DJI Smart Controller can also be used with Air 2S, and rumors claim that both the motion controller as well as the DJI goggles version 2 released with the DJI FPV drone will be compatible with it at some point. The DJI dubbed this model as all-in-one, and the way I look at it is not far off the mark. The two things that hold it back a bit are the lack of implementation of waypoints as well as the lack of ability to transmit a live video to social media platforms. May I just remind you that you can access some of the video and photo samples via the link in the description of this video. If you made it all the way through this video, I think you deserve a medal, but I also hope that it will help you to make the right decision for your needs. If you have any further questions, do not hesitate to write a comment underneath. And until the next video, it's goodbye from me.